first for a short presentation by Patrick Tanguay. And and I'm scrolling back to get everything right in front of me. Sorry for that. There he is. He is among a big group of people, very well known, because he published a newsletter called Sanchez. And as he writes himself, it's thoughtful, inquisitive, and eclectic. But that is exactly true. He is writing about all kinds of things in society, signals of change, expected futures. And one thing he particularly observed was a shared idea among many of those pieces he'd been written about just enough. And I think it's interesting to consider what we've heard so far today. I mean, we heard Alexander saying, okay, we need to think about new physical, digital spaces for innovation. We've heard Matt talking about this need for a new utopia to counter the dystopian world we all seem to have ended up in. We heard from Vladan about, how we research how everything is connected, how if you start from one thing, you can connect it all together. And that research is really important as well to understand the world we're in. And then Patrick comes with this idea, okay, maybe we can take a step back. Okay, Patrick, I want to give you the floor first. You'll do your little talk and then we'll open it up for questions.
Okay, I guess I can only see this either myself or the slides. I don't. So yeah, just enough, which I'm kind of presenting as a mental model. So I thought, I wasn't sure about how well known I would be in these circles. So I just thought I'd do a super quick presentation. So here are some of the groups I've started or co-founded or hosted. A couple of them just Montreal chapters, not the big creative mornings. I also started the first co-working space in Montreal all the way back in 2008, which was also one of the first in North America. And then I co-initiated and co-edited a print magazine for a few years, the Alpine Review, which was a great critical success, but not as much as a business success, sorry. And please pay attention to the themes there on the 3 issues: anti-fragility, returns, and permanence. I'll get back to that. Now I'm doing what got me to this speaking, the Sentier, which is a weekly newsletter, which Monique mentioned. And it's also supported by members, but all the content is only temporarily specific to members, and then it's available to everyone according to unlocked commons. And issue 144 is coming this Sunday. And I also do a couple of forms of consultancy along the side under that brand. And I hesitated to keep the quotes because it's a bit egotistical to have those great quotes, but I like getting those not only because it's flattering, but also because it's always interesting to me when I do longer term or bigger projects like each Alpine Review, which took almost a year to make, to have the words that you have in mind when you're creating it, but not necessarily haven't made public, come back to you in comments and reviews, which means that you've kind of landed what you were trying to do because people find the same words to reuse it, or even go ahead of you, like Christopher did here with, I was starting to orient towards futures and he actually put it into words before I even put it on the website. Or here, Anna, who finds her own interest in the eclectic stuff I put in there, and it's not how I would put it, but it still describes the newsletter. So I always like seeing those. The same thing when someone introduces me, it's always more interesting to see how someone presents me than how I present myself. So what I liked from the Alpine Review and decided to carry over by myself with Sentier was the creation, the assembling of ideas together, and making connections between topics. Especially because after the fact, even something you've built yourself to see what the connections are. And you can see themes emerge, which is why I mentioned to pay attention to the themes for the Alpine Review, because in each of those, we just went with our own interests, commissioned articles, did interviews, wrote articles, and in the process of reviewing everything, of doing the proofreading, we would pay attention to which article connects to which, and then come up with the order in which they would make sense, and the theme, the overarching theme, which is not the best way of getting advertisers. If we ever wanted to have advertisers, they like to have the theme ahead of time. But for us, it was always more interesting to find the red string connecting everything after the fact. And that's kind of the exercise I was doing when talking with the ThingsCon team, going back on the last year of Sentier, seeing what was most interesting and what I might talk about. And the theme that emerged from 2020 was just enough. I found that a lot of the articles I shared, even though that wasn't the purpose of each article, could be connected together and made sense together under the naming of just enough. And so instead of just seeing it as a collection that tied them together, I trying to also use it as a mental model, as a way of explaining some of the world. So here's a definition by Anne-Laure Lecoeur, who does a superb newsletter. And the highlighted phrase of "they guide our thoughts and behaviors and help us understand life" is the way I was trying to see this theme. And for instance, as I mentioned, I went from Alpine Review to Sentier, and Alpine Review was a big print magazine that took almost a year to do, with a couple of people and a lot of collaborators. So I kind of took these same selections of ideas and these same topics and compressed them into a weekly newsletter. So that was kind of just enough for me to keep doing that kind of curation and thinking, and make it public. Was simply an email newsletter. But really, in terms of the theme for last year or for this year, I started from Vaclav Smil and Rachel Caldecott. So Smil, especially often when we think of degrowth or decarbonation or what we need to do to the economy, people will think that we need to go back to something horrible or super restrictive. But really, he argues that there's quite a bit of slack. There isn't necessarily slack in the systems themselves and the way they work, as we've seen some of them have been broken during the pandemic, and we've seen them as being very brittle. But in terms of our consumption and the things we own and the things that we produce as a species, we have quite a bit of slack that we could reduce and still have a perfectly fine life, especially if we manage to spread it around much better. So that was kind of the message from Vaclav Smil. And then going to Rachel Caldecott, who always has such excellent essays, who spoke about Just Enough Internet, which is where I actually got the Just Enough moniker. And in her case, she was talking about public service that don't need to compete with companies. They often start using private sector metrics. Well, actually, maybe in most cases, just a sufficient technology would be just enough to make it work better for the people that count, instead of trying to go all out. And we can see that Just Enough Internet spreading into multiple different internet fields, like cozy communities, much smaller private social networks, simpler websites, the return of newsletters, which are based just email, some kind of return from blogs, green web ideals of looking at the electric consumption of the internet, low tech, text only websites, people doing digital fasts, deleting social network accounts, that kind of thing. And then we can even go to people, just enough people. So what is a group that is sufficient to get interesting feedback and more, not necessarily ability to scale, but ability to do more things in a more interesting way? Matt Webb, who spoke earlier, citing James Mulholland, was talking about an example of 12 members, mutual accountability on personal projects through regular presentations, was one of the examples. And we can kind of stretch that to that perhaps networking events and large amorphous groups aren't that great. Perhaps a small core of members, a squad or a senius is enough. Perhaps it's even better. And then we can also think of that on the two scales. of from the micro with your own home, or how much city we need, which we've seen during the pandemic again, that people are rethinking what city experience do they actually need, what is just enough of a city, because perhaps they want to move out, or perhaps they want to change their home. And we can go to the macro level with cities reconsidering their own geometry, what's needed for the services and the needs of their citizens. And that's a much older one. It's not from this year, but Michael Pollan is basically telling us how to eat in a just enough manner, eat food, not too much, and mostly plants. And we've seen this year. People are thinking about red meat, vegetables, veganism, alcohol, although maybe it's not just enough, and some are going bigger. Home cooking. So people are thinking of all those things, not necessarily under the framing of just enough, but that's kind of what they're doing, basically, reassessing what they're doing. From ThingsCon, Peter Beer framed it around the smart city, basing himself on the same article I used of Rachel Caldicott, and wondering and saying that perhaps a smart city just needs enough real data to make decisions, and trust democratic process by giving voice to all impacted communities. We can also, of course, look at just enough transport. Public transport is often just enough. Walking, biking, and public transport is enough. You don't necessarily need to have 3 tons of steel for each person. We can even go to just enough for citizens and consider universal basic income, which is about providing just enough money to feel more secure and give more flexibility. Or Tessie Britton's excellent universal basic everything, which is another framework, this one for basic services community needs, and which is pretty much the social infrastructure version of UBI at neighborhood scale. So in that piece, she explains how to create those social infrastructures locally. Donut economics is pretty much a just enough framework. It's about providing enough for everyone with a social foundation to ensure that no one is left falling short on life essentials. Life essentials is what's just enough, perhaps, but not too much, so that humanity does not collectively overshoot the planetary boundaries that protect Earth's life supporting systems. And then everything around ownership we've been reassessing, and can all be grouped in a way around what is just enough. So care, which I think maintenance has been discussed at the conference, repair, simply having access, a true sharing economies, and I'm not talking about Uber, co-ops, the commons, are all things that can be grouped around a kind of just enough mental model. So all of that was a bit opinionated, but it can also be used for things I don't like as much. So for example, minimum viable product is a fine way of thinking, but has often been abused and used to kind of cut off things that might have been useful in product development. But it is basically a just enough framework. And maybe we can use that same lens to look at conspiracies, which maybe they're based on just enough truth. Instead of thinking of the lies or the exaggeration, we can concentrate on the core of enough truth to understand them. And I'm not going to say who I have in mind here, but maybe some politicians are just barely smart enough to convince people to vote for them. Maybe that's the way of looking at it. But mainly the way I'm using this, importantly, is to figure out what is appropriate, not the minimum. So it could be used by someone to say we've done enough, or enough is enough. A group might think that they've done enough to diversify their workforce, or have enough women on their board. A government might think that enough is enough and try to stop protests. We've seen that again in the last couple of years. But perhaps then the time in your analysis using this mental model is for another way to read the just in just enough. So that was my thinking on Just Enough. Thank you. I've already posted it in the discussion, but if you use sautier.media/ThingsCon, it forwards you to a Miro board with some of the slides content, the slides themselves, and some extra content if you're looking for things you can ask me in the coming period. So thanks again.
Thank you so much. It's an interesting concept. It's just enough. I mean, this is such a strange year, of course, for everybody. And if anything, connectivity, that must be what pulled us through on all levels, be it scientists connecting to each other, developing vaccines, or homeschooling, or just watching Netflix, whatever. I mean, the connectivity is everywhere, and now everybody has to decide on the what's enough for particular services and goals and lives. And earlier this morning, Alexandra was also talking about this idea of living in a monastery where you sometimes have to put yourself in a cell, always be out in the courtyard. Just also, what is enough connectivity? What is enough contact? Mm-hmm. Okay, well, if you believe in this concept of just enough, how does that apply in your own life? Have you changed anything where you say like, okay, now that I take this lens and look at the things I do or the recommendations I make, what is different now?
Well, actually, it's kind of the other way around. It's one of the things I find interesting in noticing themes after the fact, is that then you can sometimes understand what you've been doing, because that's the articles that drew my attention. In this case, I knew I was doing that, and there's a reason. I know it's very adjacent to the idea of minimalism, but minimalism to me is kind of more of an aesthetic and almost something you feel you need to do if you get into that. Do I really need all of that? In more of a aesthetic thing. And I try to do more practical. So, and one example is probably that I've said a few times lately that my business model is to have as little expenses as possible. That's my basic business model. And we definitely to me, it connects a lot to the environment and pollution. So we've, in our house, we haven't had a car for a while, which I didn't mention that I'm based in Montreal. So I found it a bit easier to be just on bike in Berlin, but it's also quite doable here. I'm almost vegetarian. I always consider what I need to buy, like keeping my phone the longest possible, my computer the longest time possible. I haven't bought clothes in a year, but that's more thanks to COVID than anything else. This is the first time I wear this shirt in 2020. So to me, it's been a lot of in terms of consumption, and in terms of the web, I've also considered I've turned off Google Analytics in a few places, considering do I really need that many stats, considering the surveillance it imposes on my readers. So yeah, I've been considering it pretty much, or how many apps, on an iPad, do I really need apps for everything, or can I just go back to using websites?
So that's also limiting the number of distractions that are being served up. It's funny, in a way, it's also a little bit connected to this FIRE movement. What is it? The people that try to save as much money as they can to retire early. So they really work so that after 40 they can live their own lives and are not beholden to anyone. Yeah.
Although in their case, it's usually grab as much money as possible before retiring.
Yeah, there's a whole movement going on around 30-somethings in certain circles I know. And the one part is, of course, first earning the money because it has to come from somewhere. But the other is spending as little as you can. And that part is also like, okay, we don't need to go out for meals all the time. You don't. And in a way, this year is giving everybody sort of the experience. What does it mean when you don't go on holiday, you don't go out to restaurants, you don't shop? Actually, for a lot of us, we get lonely maybe, but we don't suffer. I mean, It's very doable. I mean, I'm asking the audience to come up with questions, and ask me anything means ask you anything. So who has a question for Patrick? There's 2 people in the chat saying that your newsletter is really truly excellent. Can you describe a little bit the process of how you put it together? What do? You wake up in the morning, you start reading from a list of preferred authors, and how do you work?
My girlfriend would probably say that I read all the time, and yes, it's pretty. I have a somewhat intricate system of managing what I read, and I try to. So I start with a Twitter list, which has just enough people that I can read the whole list, which some people find hard.
Just enough. Is that 20, 100? I follow 3,000.
It varies, but it's usually about 130 people. But it's really like, for example, sadly, I don't include William Gibson in that list anymore because he tweets too much. He's super interesting, but he takes too much space in the list.
With too many interesting thoughts that you have to read. I mean, it's interesting.
And so I concentrate on people who share, who have a reasonable rhythm of posting and share ideas and articles. And then I send everything to Instapaper, some of it in a folder specifically for Sansi, some of it in specific folders for clients. And then for each of those, I go back periodically in that folder to sort and curate what I'm going to read it, highlighting. For those who've read the newsletter, it's always a kind of summary / opinion about an article, and then the most important quotes. And so it's usually kind of reading all week. I'm also subscribed to well over 100 newsletters, but all weekly or monthly. There's I think one that's daily that I'm subscribed to, which I often don't read. And so all of those kind of funnel down into a few selections that I take care of on Friday and see what fits together. And it's always one of the, like, sometimes I'll look at the pile and it's a bit later in the day than I'd like, and I'm like, oh, why am I doing this? And then suddenly a few articles start making sense together, and if I put them in this order, it fits it brings something, and there's a new element coming out of those 5 disjointed articles. And that's the moment that I find interesting. That's why I do this. And it's also interesting because it's both more work, but it's also a filter to decide what I read. So it helps in having too much information, because I can say, this is not a recent important interest for me, and it's not something I would put in Sentier, so I can just either ignore it or put it out for much later, while before I would have not known when to read.
Funny analogy for my own life. I mean, now I'm just moderating, but very often I curate conferences, put together speakers, and so I read a lot as well. So I start reading the newspaper, trying to find things, and then if I start reading and somebody's dead, I stop reading because I cannot invite them to speak anyway. So
that's the ultimate filter.
Narrow down what you read. Oh, gone. So you read a lot, you put it together. You've made a little business out of it as well. Are you happy to share a little bit of the economics of your newsletter? I mean, how many people sign up, and what you charge? Or is that more something you want to keep to yourself? In which case, I understand.
Well, what I charge for the newsletter is on the website for the memberships. That's kind of the
okay. I don't know. So
medium term goal would be to just do Sentier, to have the membership supported, and to have Peter started on the same kind of Peter Beer started on the same kind of schedule of trying to do quarterly projects. So hopefully those projects are interesting enough to enough people to be able to sell them. In some cases it might be a course, in some cases it might be a small book, but I'll also do the same thing for clients, in which case it really varies on how much signal they want to get, whether they want to meet up every month to catch up on what the report included, whether it's monthly or it's a one-off research. So often I'll do some half day or full day dive into my archives and find everything I've seen interesting in event formats for a client who's considering organizing an event, or everything I've seen in micromobility for a client who's working with a car company who wants to be better prepared, that kind of thing.
Audience, who has a question? I can always ask questions, this. Anybody out there that has a question or a remark or a suggestion? That's possible as well. Since the topic of this week has been all kinds of developments in Internet of Things, connected objects, networks behind it, and where we save our data and what else we can do to make our lives a little bit better. I mean, are there specific developments in that field that you have been following with special interest, or are there new things coming up? Since you are, in a way, you have sensibilities to find new trends and get the weak signals and share them with your newsletter readers. What do you see happening in that field?
Well, I see I think it's disheartening when we see the surveillance or the data leaks or all those, or Google was sharing that information with everyone, or Amazon is tracking this or that. So it's a bit disheartening, but you can also look at it positively in that more and more citizens are aware of the tracking that's going on and are perhaps considering what it changes or the implications. And hopefully, like Apple, for all they have other problems, but they've been pretty quick to notice that people were starting to worry about their privacy, and have put that in their message and focus on that more. So if a big company like that sees that it might be a positive selling point, then it means that we can hope that a lot of people are aware of it. And so maybe then the more thought out, mindful of privacy products might, or perhaps more expensive or more, or do less things. I was reading a post by Matt Webb recently. I don't know, by the way, while I heard the answer he gave about publishing without reviewing, but I still don't know how he does have that many ideas every day. But he was talking about super small, what could be the smallest kind of AI or voice recognition that you could just stare at your light and say lights on, and the light would come on. So I think that there's, like, when I put a timer on Siri, I know that Siri calls the server. I'm like, why are you calling?
It should be device. It should be stored. It should be. There's a whole computing development going on where much more will be in the chips locally instead of in the cloud. It can be shared with the big companies, right?
Yeah, so it's like we see what their business model is. So I'm hopeful that I think one of the things I've discussed with Peter is things that we think we're almost late to, and then 7 years later it's big, and we're like, oh well, maybe we weren't too early 7 years ago. So I think so I'm hoping that everything that's discussed at ThingsCon is not a fringe hobby thing, but more the early discussions of something that becomes more important than those products that don't break when there's no internet, that don't track everything, that don't listen to everything we say, or get bigger audiences, which concentrating on people being aware of it is much more hopeful than concentrating on the latest moves on big tech companies.
Now, in my experience, and I've been following, was part of the team before, but I've been following their events of things. Those are exactly the places where those ideas come up first, and then, privacy design is now a really big thing. And as you say, it's now a commercial proposition as well. The more mishaps in the world of privacy, the more people get interested in those devices and those services that are actually focused on privacy.
Yeah.
Questions.
Come on, people, questions.
Come on, guys. ask me anything. It's not Monique's ask anything. It's you ask anything. Anyway, are there new plans? I mean, you already mentioned your cooperation with and new ways of finding clients for intelligence work, like you both are doing. I'm just wondering, and this is purely a private question because I'm from the world of events. So if somebody has a newsletter with such a big group of fans really following it sort of begs, okay, what's with the newsletter? You can organize an online event like this, right? You can do something with it.
It's always the same. It's the same thing we said. Making Alpine Review is that there's like this many things we want to do, but only this. So we need to put them in order.
I know.
So yes,
I know.
definitely. It's actually events was something we discussed a lot of times with the Alpine Review, which I'm also considering. But yes, it's interesting that. I'm hoping that one of the silver linings of the pandemic is that people will be much more open to attend online only events, and that some speakers will require not to travel, because if only for in terms of diversity, some people who can't travel, often young moms can't travel as much as young dads. Well, decide that they can't because of the situation and not because they actually couldn't. And so it's much easier, I think, to talk if you don't need to travel for 2 days before and after. But yes, I'm hoping to leverage that, those new possibilities in something with Santi at some point.
Okay, see, you heard it here first. Okay, well,
Patrick says just enough events.
It's like just enough events, but the quality is really high. Then even an event with 25 people can be just enough.
Exactly.
All right. Well, since there are no more questions from the audience, and it is 4:45, we're going to break here for another 10 minutes to wait for our last session. Patrick, thank you so much, and we will all now go to your website, check the newsletter.
Good. Thank you. Bye.